listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you for today's episode of The Briefing. It's fair to say that as a society, we're having more conversations about consent when it comes to the bedroom. But how can you consent to a partner who is trying to make a move when they are fast asleep?
So a common misconception, not just for sexsomnia, but for all of the non-REM parasomnias, is that it's the true person coming out in sleep.
Sexsomnia is a real condition, and in the second half of today's episode, we're going to learn all about it and the challenges that it poses to consent. But first, it's time for the headlines with Simon Beaton. Today is Tuesday, May 21st.
The International Criminal Court has announced it is seeking arrest warrants for leaders of Israel and Hamas. The ICC is pursuing the action over alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity by both sides, including in the October 7 attacks by Hamas and the subsequent war in Gaza carried out by Israel. Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu and the Minister for Defence, Yoav Gallant, have been named, along with the Gaza leader Yahya Sinwar, political chief Ismail Haniyeh, and Mohammed Diab Ibrahim al-Masri, the leader of Hamas's armed wing. Here's ICC Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan explaining the allegations against Israel.
The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, serious injury to body or health or cruel treatment, willful killing or murder, and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population, as well as crimes against humanity of extermination and or murder, persecution, and allegations of crimes of committing other inhumane acts.
Now, this is his statement on Hamas.
Extermination as a crime against humanity. Murder as a crime against humanity and as a war crime. The taking of hostages as a war crime. Rape and other acts of sexual violence during captivity as crimes against humanity and as war crimes. Torture during captivity as a crime against humanity and as a war crime.
So what happens now? Well, neither side has been found guilty or been formally accused. This is just the start of a lengthy process that could lead to prosecution. The request will go to a pre-trial panel of 3 judges who will likely take a couple of months to decide if the warrant progresses. Then, technically, countries that are members of the ICC would then be obligated to arrest those accused and they would face a trial. Simon, this is really significant. As I said, though, it doesn't mean it's one and done. There's a long process ahead. We have heard from Benjamin Netanyahu. He's responded saying, with what audacity do you compare Hamas that murdered, burned, butchered, decapitated, raped and kidnapped our brothers and sisters and the IDF soldiers fighting a just war? Hamas has also responded angrily to the move, saying the request to arrest its leaders, quote, equates the victim with the executioner. Since this war broke out, have always said that, you know, the idea of choosing a side almost seems ridiculous given what we saw happen on October 7 and then what we have seen subsequently. Hamas's statement that it equates the victim with the executioner. I mean, it is worth noting more than 35,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 7. More than 80,000 have been injured. It is horrific what is going on in Gaza, and it's clear that war crimes are happening there, but you can't then ignore what happened on October 7 either. And US President Joe Biden has also responded to this. He's labelled the warrants for the Israeli leaders as outrageous, saying whatever this prosecutor might imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. So there is international pressure building on Israel at the moment, but Joe Biden, it seems, does not support this action by the ICC.
When I was looking into this, I also saw that the ICC has so far issued arrest warrants against 42 people, 21 of whom have been detained with the help of member states. So this is early days, but even after that, who knows what will happen next. Julian Assange has been granted the right to appeal his extradition to the US by London's High Court. So the WikiLeaks founder is facing 18 criminal offences in America under the Espionage Act, including obtaining, receiving and disclosing classified information over the release of thousands of US military documents.
The judges reached the right decision. We spent a long time hearing the United States putting lipstick on a pig, but the judges did not buy it. As a family, we're relieved, but how long can this go on?
Lipstick on a pig. I love that. That was his wife, Stella Assange, speaking outside the court. The two judges made the decision based on two grounds. One was that he could be prejudiced at trial in the US because he is Australian. The other was that he may not be able to defend the charges based on the right to freedom of speech because that right isn't guaranteed for foreign nationals in the United States. The appeal will be heard at a later date. That has not been set yet.
Yeah, so he's facing a maximum of 175 years in prison, which is hefty, and has been fighting for a very long time to avoid this extradition and to avoid these charges. Now, Assange wasn't in court due to health reasons, but his wife Stella was there, as we heard, and she says she's spoken to him in the wake of the ruling and that he's relieved. So what happens next for Assange? Well, the UK court system moves notoriously slowly. He will remain at Belmarsh Prison, where he has been for the last 5 years, until we get a date for this appeal.
Sam Kerr! Of course it is!
Well, from one British court to another, we now have a date set for Sam Kerr's trial over racially aggravated harassment. The Aussie footballer is facing the charges over a night out in Twickenham in January of last year, during which she allegedly had a run-in with a police officer. A trial date has now been set down for February 2025. Talk about a slow court system. Reports claim she called the man a, quote, stupid white bastard, and Kerr has pleaded not guilty. A preliminary hearing was supposed to happen on Monday UK time, but was cancelled. So now we move to the February court date. The Chelsea captain is currently dealing with an ACL injury and sat out the second half of the Women's Super League season, while she'll be sidelined for the Matildas friendlies against China. That's happening at the end of this month in Adelaide, and then also on the 3rd of June in Sydney.
And there are calls for Australian radio stations to stop playing music by Sean Diddy Combs. It comes after horrific footage of the rapper attacking his former partner, Cassie Ventura, were published by CNN, forcing him to make an apology on social media.
Yeah, and an unlikely campaigner has emerged. Deputy Liberal leader Sussan Ley is calling for Aussie media companies to boycott his songs. I didn't expect it from her, but I can't say I'm displeased. I was saying this yesterday in the newsroom that we should not, because where we work with radio stations as well, and I hear all the music they play all day, every day, and there's a lot of Diddy music that plays on the air. Sussan Ley wants businesses to reconsider any activities they may be taking that could be financially benefiting him, also commenting about the fact that, you know, we need to send a clear message about domestic violence. And if we have seen anything in this country in the last few months, that is very clear. I agree with her on this one. And in terms of boycotts, we have seen this a couple of times in the past. So Chris Brown, who's a rapper who has also been charged with domestic violence charges, had his music pulled off air years back when he was facing court over allegations he had attacked Rihanna, the singer. Michael Jackson as well has had his music pulled from the air. And one more recently is Sticky Fingers, which is a Sydney band. They were pulled from Triple J's rotation and also axed from Blues Fest.
Yeah.
And this was because the lead singer had been accused of some racist abuse, which he has denied. So it's not out of the ordinary. We have definitely seen it before.
We have seen, as you said, the music of Chris Brown and Michael Jackson. That's come back on again. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah. Simon, thanks so much for joining us for the headlines. Next up, it's our deep dive into Sexsomnia, what it is and the challenges it can present to consent.
You've heard of insomnia, but what about sexsomnia? Sexsomnia is a sleep disorder that causes people to engage in sexual behaviours in their sleep, such as dirty talk, masturbating, and even intercourse. However, conducting studies on sexsomnia can be really difficult, as most people have no memory of their actions and only become aware from a partner or after injuring themselves, as it most commonly occurs during the deepest stage of sleep. Sexsomnia is listed in the DSM, basically the Bible of psychological disorders. It's classified as a non-rapid eye movement parasomic behaviour characterised by sexual activity during sleep. Which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's just to say that this is a scientifically recognised condition. Now, unsurprisingly, sexsomnia is pretty controversial when it's used as a defence in cases of sexual assault and consent, with some cases being found not guilty because of sexsomnia. In this episode of The Briefing, we're joined by Dr David Cunnington, a specialist sleep physician, and Aleks Trkulja, who's an individual and couples therapist at the Pleasure Centre. Firstly, Dr Cunnington, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. Is sexsomnia real?
It absolutely is a thing. So there's a group of disorders called non-REM parasomnias, and think of that as automatic behaviours that can occur during sleep. Sleep talking, sleep eating, sleep walking, and sexsomnia or sleep sex is another version of those non-REM parasomnias.
So how common is sexsomnia? Because I've heard about insomnia, I've heard about sleepwalking, sleep talking, but I feel like we don't really talk or hear much about sexsomnia.
So it's actually reasonably common, not as common as sleep talking, but more common often than what people will think about, because it's not the sort of thing people talk about really. It's a pretty private thing, and sometimes people only talk about it if it's causing problems in a relationship or problems between a couple. Is often when people might go and see their healthcare professional, or they might end up in my office as a specialist sleep physician who's working in this area. Around 2 in 100 adults have some form of non-REM parasomnia, and a reasonable proportion of those at some time will have sexualised behaviours or sexsomnia as part of those non-REM parasomnias.
Then could I be experiencing sexsomnia and not realise it?
Absolutely. So that's one of the characteristics of non-REM parasomnias generally, is the person who's having those behaviours has very little recollection, or in fact often no recollection of what's gone on. And in the case of sexsomnia, it's the partner that says, hey, this happened, and it often leads to pretty challenging discussions the next day, particularly as the person who's doing it doesn't recall that. And it's definitely not a conscious behaviour. These things occur in a deep stage of sleep, generally stage 3, non-REM sleep, what we used to call slow wave sleep. And it's the type of sleep where people, 1, don't have control over what they're doing, and 2, have no recollection of what's been happening.
So is sexsomnia always intercourse? Tell me about some of the different behaviours it's classified as.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not always intercourse. As we know, there's a whole range of different sexualised behaviours. And so sexsomnia can take any of those forms. I say a whole range of behaviours, which can just be cuddling, it can be kissing, it can be fondling, it can be rubbing up against someone, it can be, anything up to and including intercourse.
Are there any misconceptions about the condition?
So a common misconception, not just for sexsomnia, but for all of the non-REM parasomnias, is that it's the true person coming out in sleep. You've been able to hide the fact while you're awake that you're really just a very aggressive, nasty type of person, and now you're asleep. Your true feelings for me are coming out, and you really are shouting at me, swearing at me, trying to hit me, try to have sexual intercourse or sexualised behaviours with me, and there's your true personality that's come out. Now, that has its origins in some Freudian sort of teachings or Freudian ways of conceptualising some of these behaviours, but in fact that's totally false. These behaviours have no link to our waking personality. And in fact, what's happening biologically is the cortex and what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's got our values, our sort of what we stand for, our personality. In these behaviours, that part of the brain is offline. So your normal sort of value filter, you've got these very primitive, raw behaviours. Normally while we're awake, it would run through our values filter and we'd go, no, that's not me. I'm not going to do that. But while we're asleep in a non-REM parasomnia, that filter's offline. So you don't actually get to apply your values to make a judgment of, will I do that behaviour? and is just that very raw, unfiltered behaviour. And so rather than reflecting someone's true personality and it coming out at night, in fact, their true personality is offline and taken out of it.
Speaking of behaviours, when would sexsomnia start? Would it be the same as when you're going through puberty?
Yeah, it's a very biological behaviour. And much in the same way as, you see animals. My son's into cows and breeding cattle, and we can tell when a cattle's nearing puberty or nearing sexual maturation because sexualised behaviour begins to appear. If you think of it as an automatic behaviour, similarly in humans, sexualised non-REM parasomnias or sexsomnias will generally only begin to appear once sexual behaviours are part of the natural behaviours. So that is after puberty.
Are there any triggers for sexsomnia? So can any lifestyle behaviours increase your chances of having sexsomnia, or is it always part of you?
No, absolutely. So there are definitely things that will make any of the non-REM parasomnias more likely. For a non-REM parasomnia to occur, you've got to have that bulk of the brain asleep. So you've got to be sort of deeply asleep, but you've got to have that fight-flight response of the brain awake. So you've almost got to have the brain sort of doing two separate things at the one time. So things that can create that state are things that are going to make the bulk of the brain sleep more deeply. Think of that as being sleep deprived, being overly sleepy, trying to sleep, very late in the night when you're absolutely exhausted, sedative medications, alcohol, they'll all promote that sort of sleepiness. And then things that increase that alertness, stress is probably the biggest one. Again, sleeping at a time when you would normally be asleep, so people who do shift work. And so all of those factors will increase the likelihood of having non-REM parasomnias. So it's really common for me to see people who may not have it, but then may have a period of time when life's pretty stressful and they're pretty busy and get a bit sleep deprived, and maybe also take a bit of alcohol to help manage sleep with managing the stress. And there you've got this sort of cluster that all comes together and they start to get non-REM parasomnias. The unfortunate bit is once someone starts to get non-REM parasomnias, particularly sexsomnia, you don't want it to happen. So you're almost trying to sleep with one ear open to self-monitor to try and prevent it happening. And that's exactly the type of sleep where it is going to happen more. So once it starts to happen and you start to be anxious about it happening, it almost guarantees it's going to happen more, and it's a vicious cycle.
Now let's hear from Aleks Trkulja, an individual and couples therapist at the Pleasure Centre. Aleks, so how do we bring consent into the conversation?
That's a good question. I guess perhaps they're starting to talk about it more because discourse around consent and safe sex is a really big topic at the moment. And obviously consent can be a really big issue with sexsomnia if there's potential assault happening during an episode. So perhaps it's also becoming a larger conversation of people experiencing assault by a partner, but it's a sexsomnic episode.
Yeah, so on the back of that, people charged with sexual assault have used sexsomnia as a defence. Would you be able to talk us through some of the complexities there?
Look, I think in our justice system, we can use mental health conditions and some other conditions in order to excuse certain behaviours. That is complex in itself because it's not as simple as it being a bit of a blanket approach. I think sexual assault is really nuanced, and ultimately the complexity around sexsomnia is that if you're unconscious and assaulting someone, it is different to being conscious and intentionally assaulting someone, but we also have to look at the safety of victim survivors of assault and recognise that it is technically unwanted touch, it is sexual assault and or rape in some of these situations, which makes it really complex.
You touched on consent before. Is there any way to maintain consent when you have sexsomnia?
I don't know that you can maintain consent if you're unconscious and you're not actually conscious to receive consent from the person you're touching. I think in order for consent to happen, you both need to be, or two or more people need to be conscious and fully aware of what's about to happen, because even if you were to establish consent with a long-term partner, let's say around like, oh, if this were to happen tonight, like, just know, like, what if they change their minds in between that conversation and touch being initiated? A very important part of consent is that it can be updated. I don't think it's as simple as blanket consent, because blanket consent around things like kissing a long-term romantic partner, people go, yeah, sure, I'm happy for them to come give me a kiss. I don't need to give consent every time. But with sexsomnia, we don't know necessarily what kind of sexual behavior could occur. So it's not as simple as a blanket consent of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. So if somebody has sexsomnia or might think they have sexsomnia, what's a good way to find support?
I think that the first place you can go is a GP to discuss any symptoms you're noticing or any observations a partner has had about your behavior during sleep, and to know that it is a condition and it can be managed. A GP will likely connect you with a sleep specialist that can then help you to address the underlying triggers for sexsomnia.
That was Aleks Trkulja from the Pleasure Centre and specialist sleep physician Dr David Cunnington. Thanks for listening. That's it for this episode. But before you go, if you liked this ep, we'd love it if you could share it with someone else you think might enjoy it too. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Insta at The Briefing Podcast or on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.